evening, everyone. It is 8:01 p.m. We have returned from executive session. There was no further business to discuss or vote on. And now that brings us up to the Pledge of Allegiance. If you'd all please rise, and Trustee Raphael Flipman, would you please lead us in the pledge?
Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Just a reminder of the emergency evacuation exits directly to the back of the room, and to my right, your left, who are, for those sitting in the audience. Reminder that these exit locations are there. In the event there is an emergency, please leave in an orderly fashion through these exits. This is also a smoke-free school district. Smoking is not permitted in the building or anywhere on the school grounds. This is also a hate-free and bully-free school district. And again, thank you for attending our meeting of February 1st. And we will begin with the board consent agenda, item number C. Mr. Superintendent?
President Felice, the administration recommends the approval of board consent items reflected in Schedule C1 through C3.
Okay, we need a motion for C1 through C3. Is there a motion? Motion by Trustee Flippin, seconded by Trustee Barry. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor, please raise your hands. Seeing all hands raised, the motion passes unanimously. Now we're on to communication and announcements, and we begin with the superintendent's report.
President Felice and trustees, I'm going to be doing my presentation from the podium today. There's quite a few slides that I want to share with the trustees and with the community, so I'm going to make my way over there. And technology, I'll give you the indication when to switch to full screen. Thank you. All right.
Are you doing the budget presentation now?
No.
No.
No, I didn't.
Oh, okay. I want to make
It'd
sure.
be easier for me to
Got
look at
it,
the
got
slide.
it. Okay, no worries.
All right, at this time, you can switch to full screen. Thank you. Always a pleasure and privilege to give my superintendent's report. Last time I gave my report, we were scheduled to do it, bless you, in mid-January. Because of some technology glitches, we were unable to broadcast it. So I kind of want to repeat it just in case people miss some of the exciting sort of events I want to share with the community that highlights a lot of the great things that we're doing in the district. I also want to caution the trustees and the public who is listening that there is so much more happening. And I want to encourage folks to listen to, or rather visit our website, follow us on the different social media platforms, Twitter, Instagram. There are various groups that have them, from our athletics to our music to our world languages, only because it's impossible for me to capture everything that goes on. So let me begin first by repeating this slide that we did in December. Ironically, snow was not in the forecast at all this week, but we got little flurries for 2 consecutive days. I was communicating with our facilities director, Mr. Pearl, this morning when I was looking at my phone and it indicated no snow, and yet it was snowing in my neighborhood. So just a reminder of our inclement weather plan. Typically, we delay the opening of schools or have early dismissals, or we shut schools down when the conditions get too dangerous for safe transportation for both our students who arrive to school in buses or students, frankly, who walk to school. There are various mechanisms you can use to be apprised of these closings or early dismissals or delayed openings. These are all radio stations that would broadcast this information regularly. But just to give you sort of, again, a quick recap, when a snow day is called, all buildings, including the YMCA before and after school program at South Haven and at the YMCA in Patchogue, will be canceled for the day. In terms of a delayed opening, when a 2-hour delayed opening is called, the before school program at South Haven and at the YMCA in Patchogue will be canceled because they obviously start before our start time. All other buildings will open 2 hours after their traditional start times, including the bus pickup times. So if you hear about a 2-hour delay and your child takes the bus, they should be reported to the bus stop 2 hours later than their normal time. And an early dismissal is very rare because usually if there's inclement weather coming in throughout the course of a school day, In all likelihood, schools shut down because we don't want to take the risk. But if this ever were to happen, Bellport High School would be dismissing 30 minutes early. The middle school at Frank P. Long, 15 minutes early. Elementary school is approximately at their regular time. This is due to busing and really organizing the early dismissal. Like I said, early dismissals are sort of a rare occurrence. And finally, on the topic of snow, we all feel that snow days should be snow days. There have been conversations in New York City where snow days would be days of virtual learning. I certainly don't subscribe to that philosophy, except if we have multiple days that we're closed and we're running the risk of losing instructional days. Then we have to revisit that. So far, the outlook does not look so bad in terms of snow, although I want to caution the board and the community that this weekend is going to be frighteningly cold with lows in the single digits. So be mindful of weather and please dress appropriately. Next, our COVID-19 update. I provide it because I think it's a topic that should be discussed. It's not a requirement for us to discuss this at board meetings. But these were our numbers as of January 20th. And I wanted to compare those numbers to the numbers at January 27th. If I go back and forth, we had 6 additional total cases during that week. And so the numbers are somewhat dwindling. This is just an anecdotal observation, not based on any scientific research. But by all my experience and conversations, it seems like these numbers are starting to dwindle. So I'm hoping that the surge that we saw in December and just immediately after the holiday is sort of dwindling. But again, do everything you can to stay safe. That includes washing hands. We say that ad nauseum. Certainly wear a mask if you're symptomatic or feel like you're vulnerable. And ultimately it's a personal decision whether or not you vaccinate yourself or subscribe to the vaccines, but it certainly is recommended by the CDC and Department of Health. We have our COVID information posted on our website. When you click the link, it opens up another page with different resources. But there's been no changes. If anything, we're moving in the right direction in terms of normalizing our schools and the operations. And we've had some fantastic events and live events. We're happy to be bringing them back. Bellport High School music. So, love our music program, love seeing these performances. I had the privilege of going to the chamber concert. Pardon me. Where I got to see several of our performing groups perform. It was another great night of music at Bellport High School. I enjoyed listening to our chamber strings, picture there, our jazz ensemble, our flute choir, our percussion ensemble, and when you look at the little photograph here in the center, they were playing from Empty Pails, which reminded me of my days in the cities, where I used to see a lot of street performers, really like talented street performers do magical things with these pails. So to watch our students kind of take their skills that they've learned on traditional percussion instruments and sort of generalize them and use them on these pails was kind of cool to watch. And we also got to spend some time with some alumni. Pictured here, and I apologize for not naming folks, but their Bellport High School grads are pursuing either in music careers, music teaching careers, or student teaching, which I think is fantastic. And a nice accolade to our music department for inspiring students to pursue music education. So specifically, I want to give a shout out to Ms. Hartman, Mr. Finnegan, Ms. Grunenberg, Ms. Wasson, and Ms. Valenti for doing their thing and promoting music. And of course, for the trustees who attended, Ms. Hayes and Ms. Felice, for coming down and joining me for this concert. We also got to enjoy a concert at Brookhaven Elementary School, which was just as remarkable to me and just as fun. One of the things that I really took away from it was the number of students participating, not just singing, but they played xylophones and all different sorts of instruments, and they played a lot of really cool songs. One of the highlights was a 3rd grader named Maya Dollop, who played the bass. She joined sophomore 10th grader Caitlin Schusler and accompanying Mr. Kasi, who was a music teacher, and putting some pretty cool musical selections, including La Bamba. I think I was singing that song on my drive back to work and later on my drive home. But again, what a wonderful display of kids engaged, great participation from the community. We had a lot of parents attending. What I love most about it is a dual language school, and the whole concert was kind of presented in Spanish and English. And to see the looks on the families' faces and the kids' faces when they really feel a sense of belonging and part of the community, when you speak in their language, was a remarkable thing to behold. So I think the culture there has just been fantastic, and I just love the sense of family that is displayed or is on display at Brookhaven Elementary School. And of course, I want to give a shout out to the music teacher, Mr. Kasi, did a fantastic job. Maya Dalla, third grade bass player extraordinaire, our 10th grader, Caitlin Schusler, who volunteered her time to accompany Mr. Kasi, and of course the building administration for supporting music. And again, our trustee Felice for attending the concert and enjoying it as much as I did. The music continues. I went down to Frank P. Long, actually I went to the middle school for Frank P. Long's winter concert. What was most remarkable about that concert was the sheer number of students participating in this music program. Based on the program, there were 127 kids singing with the chorus, not to mention all the kids who participated in the senior band. Now, seniors is a little bit of a misnomer, because we're not talking about high school seniors, we're talking about Frank P. Long seniors, who are 5th graders, and our senior orchestra as well. Really fantastic to see the progression. My first concert in South Country was last spring, before I assumed the position of superintendent. I had the privilege of attending a concert at the courtyard at Frank P. Long, and I watched these kids play. To see the progress that they've made from that time in the spring to now was really remarkable. So I want to give a big shout out to the chorus director, Mr. Giamona, who somehow manages all these kids and gets them to sing 127 at a time. It's no easy feat. Ms. Romano, our orchestra director, Ms. Rouse, our band director, of course Ms. Hartman, the department chairperson, and of course Principal Rosinski, and for Dr. Colston for opening up the middle school so we can host the event. I also want to note, standing room only. There had to be, I don't know what the capacity is of that auditorium, but every seat was filled, the sides were filled, and everybody had a fantastic time. So again, I want to thank Trustee Felice and Trustee Hayes for attending along with me. I think we all had a fantastic time. Next, I'm going to move on to basketball. I had the good fortune of attending a basketball game. I wish I could get out to most of them. But first, I got to see the boys varsity team in action against Longwood, and I watched them win in commanding fashion. They're one of the top-seeded teams in our division, so we're going to look forward, hopefully, to a nice playoff run. So it was fantastic just to see them play. I even got an opportunity to bring my own son to watch the game, which is fantastic, and he was also very much impressed, not just by the sportsmanship and just the level of the skills on both teams, to be honest, but just the spirit that was on display here at South Country. I also want to give a shout out to one of our students, Amir Bell, who's named one of Long Island's top 100 basketball players. So that's a nice little accolade for Mr. Bell. I also had the good fortune of visiting the girls' varsity basketball game, also against Longwood. They didn't win this competition. However, I've never seen a team play with such heart, and they were playing as if they were in it the entire game. So big shout out to all of the student athletes who participate in our girls program, and even a bigger shout out to our very own Bryn Johnson, who could not be here tonight, and I enjoy embarrassing her in public, but she too was named one of Long Island's top 100 basketball players. She plays the game really hard, and so impressed by her, so I just wanted to give her and her teammates a shout out. Still in the accolades continue for South Country. Our Bellport football players also had some state recognition this past month, or the month of January. A couple of students, Dante Phillip and Jason Hunt, they made first team All-State. Second team All-State was made by Luis Rodriguez, and fifth team All-State, Justin Miles. So I just want to thank Coach Fabian and his staff for just being a good mentor to these students and kind of paving the way for another championship season. A lot of accolades there. Our wrestling team won or clinched the League 4 championship with a 37-22 victory over North Babylon. That happened a couple of weeks ago. This was their 5th consecutive title for the Bellport varsity wrestling team. We're going to be competing in individual league championships, hopefully this weekend on Saturday, February 4th. The high school is hosting an invitational featuring several school districts. Depending on how the wrestlers perform, they get to compete at the end of the day, which is roughly around 3 o'clock, for the individual championships. So again, these festivities start at 9 a.m. It's a whole day of competition that kind of culminates in the championship rounds. So let's keep our fingers crossed and think about our Clippers as they compete on a county level. I also wanted to point out that 5 of our fall varsity teams earned the Scholar Athlete Team Award from Section 11. This is awarded to teams that maintain a 90-plus overall average for the entire team. The teams include girls soccer, girls tennis, girls cross country, boys cross country, and boys golf. So congratulations to those teams and those coaches for really emphasizing academics and for performing not just well on the field, on the competitive field, but academically. And I want to emphasize, let's not forget to mention our middle school sports as well. They're going on. This is a shot with the cheerleading team from the middle school, and a big sort of credit to our coaches. A couple of weeks ago, Section 11 acknowledged Coaches Appreciation Day, and I just wanted to publicly appreciate our coaches, not just for engaging in great competition, but for the mentorship they provide our students, and really the niche they create for so many students as well. Athletics serves such a bigger role in our school district than just competition. Along the wrestling theme, no wrestling theme, I also had a chance to visit varsity bowling. So really cool that we have a bowling team. This is a shot of the boys varsity bowling team. I did not have an opportunity to see them play. I got there just after they had finished at Sable Lanes, but I was lucky enough to visit the girls team up in East Islip when they were competing. The only negative thing I could say about my visit to this bowling competition is that it made me feel really bad about my own bowling skills. The girls were fantastic, so I just want to give a shout out to, first and foremost, Coach Reuter, who was a coach for the boys, for paving the way, and Coach Satterley, who is the coach for the girls, who's pictured here. And just an announcement, hot off the press, the girls just solidified a wild card spot for the county playoffs next week. So congratulations to them, another great source of Clipper pride. And I want to thank President Felice as well for joining me and kind of sharing her own bowling history from back in her days when she was a bowler. And just to kind of recap our winter sports, we have varsity basketball, junior varsity basketball, varsity bowling, varsity winter track, varsity wrestling, and varsity cheerleading. The reason I have asterisks next to those two sports is because those sports basically have both males and females competing together. So little known fact, or maybe not so little known fact, but several school districts have females participating in varsity wrestling, and they do compete against male opponents. And they fare very well. Our middle school also is hosting winter sports. They finished their early winter season, which included boys basketball and girls volleyball, and now they're in their second half of their late winter season, which includes wrestling and girls basketball. And finally, Frank P. Long is hosting intramurals. Intramurals will also commence in the last quarter for the middle school as well, as the advisors who do the intramurals at the middle school for the 6th grade are currently coaching. So we kind of postponed the intramurals for later in the year. Speaking about female athletes participating in wrestling, this past week, New York State Public High School Athletic Association hosted the first ever Girls Invitational up in Syracuse. Approximately 450 student athletes participated in this first ever competition, which is really remarkable to see and great to see. But even better for us, we participated, and a big shout goes to Cadence Howard for placing 5th overall at the first Wrestling Invitational up in Syracuse. So big shout out to Cadence representing the school district and placing 5th. There she is in the picture. And moving forward, in my conversation with Mr. Hayes, our athletic director, they're going to make these an annual event, not just for wrestling, but they're looking into different sports to create more equity in athletics. So a lot of great things going on the field, but it doesn't stop there. We also had our winter athletes visiting Brookhaven Elementary School as part of their restorative athletes. Basically, the winter athletes spent some time with their younger peers at Brookhaven Elementary School. They discussed just different social and emotional, and it's part of our social and emotional learning program called Second Step. So it is something that's organized and structured, but more than that, it's a great experience for all involved. The younger kids really look up to high school students as if they're like role models, and I think the high school students, and I wish Bryn was here to verify this because she too participated, really get a kick of, and really get like sort of so inspired by high school students, and vice versa, the high school students love just playing that role for the younger kids. So I think bridging that gap between our secondary schools and elementary schools is fantastic, and this is really a fantastic way to do that. Moving on, right after our prior to our last board meeting being scheduled, we observed Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. And I wanted to speak a little bit about that because one of the things I spoke about in my weekly update and I tweeted was this whole notion, and this quote, which I love, which says that the function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically intelligence plus character, that is a goal of true education. And I want to emphasize that in many respects, we sort of carry that sort of a tradition here, and we do it through different things like our equity committee. Again, we want to make sure we promote student success for all of our community members in an equitable manner. Community resource network, where we bring in different community members and organizations to speak to one another so that we're all apprised of the resources that are available to our community. Our restorative practices that speak to character. Our seal of civic readiness, which really is one of the most important, I think, aspects of this, because you know, one of the things that we always say as a school district is that we're impartial, we're politically neutral. Really our role is to really instill the skills necessary so that students can go out into the real world and be advocates. They don't need to be neutral. They can advocate for their belief systems and what they believe in. And our job is to sort of like be that impartial facilitator for them acquiring these skills, which I think are really important. So the seal of civic readiness basically answered this question that or the concern that there wasn't enough civics education taught in schools. And so the seal of civic readiness basically is an accolade to get on the diploma, basically saying that you've been educated on civics, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So again, that speaks to character and education coming together. We have Generation Citizen that comes in, and that serves as part of our Civics Day, which I'll talk about in a second. And even AP Capstone. Our students are choosing research projects that really speak to community engagement and making improvements in the day-to-day lives of not just themselves, but community members. So talking about civil engagement, I had the good fortune, along with Trustee Hayes and Trustee Felice, to attend Civics Day at Bellport High School. Civics Day basically is a process facilitated by their social studies teachers that enable students to reach consensus on topics they felt were important. Then as a collective, meaning the whole class, they engaged in research to support their positions with the goal of presenting their proposals to stakeholders who essentially have decision-making power. In this case, myself, a superintendent, trustees, they had some elected officials, including, so on this particular day, their audience included Board President Felice, Vice President Hayes, New York Senator Dean Murray, and legislator Dick Thorne. So they had actual people listening to sort of their research and their proposals. Presentations included advocacy that ranged from introducing students to world languages in the 7th grade, having an open campus. Sorry, my notes didn't match my slides. Students advocating for open campus for seniors. Students advocating for single color graduation gowns, which I'll talk about in a second. But it just was remarkable to see that what all these sort of presentations had in common was compassion that the students felt for others, members of their community. So here's some of the students who presented with regards to a crosswalk on Dunson Avenue and South Country Road. The students felt the crosswalk was dangerous, it was missing a traffic light, the lines aren't painted clearly, and they were able to make this pitch directly to an elected official, which I thought was fantastic. This is what we talk about, civic engagement. And again, the class came to a consensus on this project that really didn't serve them specifically, but really was for the overall safety of our larger community, which I thought was fantastic. They also talked about mental health and social and emotional learning opportunities through mental health days. They even included a shot of Newsday with the mental health days as a headline. And the premise behind this presentation was, while we allow students a certain allowance for absences for parents to call a student in out of school, maybe there should be a mechanism that if a student's having a rough day or really is going through some mental health concerns at home, that school should be aware. So instead of just kind of calling the school and saying my child's going to be out, maybe kind of cluing into our support staff or mental health professionals to say my child is having a difficult time, so we can provide interventions. Great topic for discussion raised by these students. We also had advocacy for a senior lounge, which made a lot of sense in terms of just quality of life things for high school students. And it's just another shot of all the students together with their teacher. And I will give a shout out to all the teachers when I finish sharing, because there's more. We also had a presentation about pollution in our waterways. And this was the one that really hit me. Students kind of advocated for single color graduation gowns for a variety of reasons. But in making their argument, they used a photo of one of my former graduations where I served as principal, and there's my picture, because in 2019, Glen Cove High School adopted single color gowns, and I was a part of that process. So the students did their research, found a picture of me, and used it, I don't want to say against me, but they used it to their advantage, which is pretty cool. And again, I want to give a big shout out to Ms. Doyle, Ms. O'Hagan, our social studies teachers, Mr. Plouffe, Mr. Boudris, Mr. Scioli, Ms. Malloy, Ms. Schossler, our library media specialist, Ms. Oates Robish, and for her coordination, Ms. Blasik for her connections with elected officials, Senator Murray and Legislator Thorne for taking their time out of their busy schedules, joining us at the school, and of course, President Felice and Vice President Hayes, who also participated in the day. And again, this was an opportunity for us to be civically engaged. If you don't know what civics is, it's the study of the rights and duties of citizenship. And I think we saw that on display throughout all these student presentations. Moving on to AP Seminar student presentations, which again was really impressive to me. Students in AP Seminar, as part of their culminating project for the class, they were administered an AP Seminar Performance Task 1. Students worked in teams to identify, investigate, and analyze an academic or real-world problem or issue, and consider options or alternatives. And they need to present and defend their proposed solutions or resolutions to the class as part of their grade. What's really cool about AP Seminar is everything is guided by the students. The teacher just facilitates, but they're almost not allowed to help them. It's just basically, here are some of the skills you need to do research, and students pick their topics and engage in this learning. The topics, and here's just a range of schedules of all their presentations, but they identify topics that range from inflation and pollution to mental health to the effects of social standards on the arts, which I thought was a really cool topic to sort of dive into. All really impressive. So again, I want to give credit and shout out to Beth Doyle, Jackie O'Hagan, and to Jack Bork for, again, bringing Capstone to South Country, and to our teachers, Mr. Bishop and Ms. Fur Thompson, for being great mentors to their students. And again, Ms. Oates Robish, who coordinated this in the library. And this is just a shot of the students who presented. I was unfortunately not able to see all the presentations because they spanned over 2 days. But again, so impressed. And another source of Clipper pride. And it's not just the students who are being civically engaged. I had the good fortune of attending the South Country PTA Council dinner, where we got to sort of commiserate with other school districts and other PTA members. Again, I want to encourage parents who are listening or who are present, be involved in the schools. That's a part of citizenship. If you want to be informed or affect positive change or support students, get involved. Becoming a PTA member does not imply commitments or time. It just means that you'll be kept in the loop, and of course you can participate and be involved as much as you can. So I listed all the sort of links here for all the membership hubs for each of the schools, but I do encourage our community members to be a part of our learning community. And in terms of trustees, we also get civically engaged. A couple of, 2 weeks ago, January 26th, just 1 week ago, we were able to join the annual joint conference by NYSSBA, which is the Nassau Suffolk School Boards Association, the Nassau County Council of School Superintendents, and the Suffolk County School Superintendents Association joint conference. And the featured speaker on that particular night was our state comptroller, Tom DiNapoli, who provided information regarding the economic outlook of the state, as well as some insights as to school aid and future initiatives held by the state. And there was a bit of a silver lining on this evening because there was a blending of two worlds. I got to sit at the table with not just our trustees, Trustee Felice and Trustee Piccini, but also with Glen Cove's, my former superintendent and former board members. And it was kind of great to connect the two worlds and speak to one another and realize that we're unified in our advocacy for learning in school districts. So that was kind of a cool experience, and it was both Glen Cove and Clipper pride. But my commitment and my loyalty is to South Country, so no offense to Glen Cove. And we're going to continue this practice this weekend by attending our legislative breakfast in Longwood. It's an annual event that basically gives school trustees and board members an opportunity to hear from legislators, speak about the legislative process. So I'll be attending that as well. And I do want to give a shout out as well to Chris Piccini, our trustee, who represents South Country as a NYSBA executive on their NYSBA executive committee. So thank you for your participation in that. And that concludes my, one more thing, again, keep in touch, keep informed, visit our website. I'll say this at every board meeting, we have the community portal, that'll give you access to any correspondence that's sent out district-wide of any importance. We also have the superintendent's corner. When you click that link, you'll open up my corner. That screenshot was from January, but I do update it on a monthly basis. My contact information is located on the superintendent's corner. My Twitter feed is located there, as well as my weekly update or blog that I provide the district. So please keep informed, access our website. And finally, I just want to thank everyone for their commitment to the South Country School District. It really is a pleasure to serve you all as your superintendent. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so we'll continue on with the trustee and advisory committee reports. Who would like to start? Trustee Kavanaugh, would you like to
I can
start?
start, sure. Last night, we had our Health and Safety Committee meeting, discussed a wide range of things. Just a couple of things I'd like to highlight is we have procured and received new radios for our school safety officers. Big improvement in technology and their ability to communicate and of course, keep the kids safe. We received building updates from each of the school buildings regarding ongoing issues. Most of the issues had been resolved or were being resolved at the time of our meeting, so it seems like we're in good shape in that regard. And then we had a discussion, did not come to any conclusions, but had a discussion about something that the superintendent alluded to, a good problem, and that is the attendance at our musical concerts. I believe that the Frank P. Long concert was the one where there was standing room only, so we had a very fruitful discussion about that from a safety perspective, and discussed a couple of options about how we could make those events, well attended, still safe for all of the attendees and all of the students. Thank you.
No, nothing today.
Nothing to report.
You want me to come back to you? You want to go now?
I'll just add that, thank you for reminding us about all of these things. And I wanted to comment that on Civics Day, in addition to everybody else that you mentioned, the woman who's the director of the Generation Citizen program itself attended. I think her office is in Manhattan. And also, there were guests from some other school districts who wanted to see what we were doing here. And I just wanted to raise that up to point out, to use your words, we're ahead of the curve here, and people are taking notice even outside the district.
Yeah, for the sake of the trustees, it was Riverhead School District and Lindenhurst had representatives from the school district just to see how our Civics Day operated, because they're looking to sort of establish something similar in their school districts.
And then the other comment has to do with the very active PTA this year. I went to the meeting at Frank P. Long last week, where they're all, the people who attended it are, they're very enthusiastic about what they're doing for the benefit of the kids. But after that, there was game night in the gym. And I'd never been to one up at Frank P. Long. It's a math game.
24, it's addicting.
Right.
It's an amazing game.
Okay, you know what was so amazing about it, though, is the audience, there were chairs all around the gymnasium. They were filled. And then you had the 6 tables of 4 kids, I think it was, to participate in the game, the competition itself. Everybody was quiet. I can't tell you when we've been to an event at a school where there's been quiet, and that enabled the kids to be able to concentrate on what they were doing. It was great. But there was a break and an opportunity to talk to people, and the parental feedback, again, it was about as enthusiastic as what I saw for the PTAs, and very gratifying to hear about how excited they are for the opportunities that their kids are getting. So, thanks again to everybody who's involved in that.
Thank you. Trustee Merrick?
Ultimately, very little to share, but the enthusiasm that I hear about returning to normalcy for students in terms of Frost Valley return and their meeting and the excitement of our seventh graders who will be heading off there as well. And it was just good positive things. And then the high school this week has the ski trip. And so I know Bryn reported at the last meeting about that and the enthusiasm of the students. So it is exciting to see some of those ancillary activities to go along with the great academics as well as athletics.
Thank you. Trustee Pacino?
Thank you. So it was a great update with all the sports, right? And you kind of led into one of the things, and I was going to mention the girls wrestling. I have a close friend who's in the East Islip District, and he's one of the main people who's been spearheading girls wrestling in the county and on Long Island. As a matter of fact, he was on like Good Morning America, the Today Show last year with his daughters, talking about his efforts and how he's really helped grow the sport. And I know he has a real strong advocate in our wrestling coach, and Mr. Marigiolio, whose daughter is also one of our 3 wrestlers. So it was nice to see one of our wrestlers, female wrestlers, make the podium, which was really great. And it's great to talk about it today because today is Women and Girls Day in Sports, National Girls Women in Sports Day. I think that's how you say it. It's a mouthful, so I thought I'd mention that. I learned something really cool this morning as an avid NFL fan that I never knew until I listened to the Boomer and Gio show this morning on WFAN. And if anybody knows that Greg Giannotti, is an alumni of Belport High School and a former football player. And he's always been around, and he's a great guy to talk to. But I did not know that one of his classmates from 22 years ago is on his way to his 3rd Super Bowl in 22 years. This next weekend with the Philadelphia Eagles. And I was stunned to hear that, and he mentioned it because Newsday called him, did an article, The Advance published an article that'll be out tomorrow that was online, but I have his name here, so I want to say it right. He is, I thought I had his name, yes, I did save it. Greg Delamitros. Did I say that right, Nelson? You'd know that. So he graduated 22 years ago as a football player and an alumni, and he is the vice president of equipment, but I want to say the title right. Vice President of Equipment Operations, which in the NFL is a huge job. So this is his 3rd Super Bowl since he's been there. He has a Super Bowl ring from when they won it the last time. And it's interesting if you're a football fan. He went to the Super Bowl with, Andy Reid, Doug Peterson, and now Greg Serrano. And they're 3, pretty impressive people. So I thought it was really kind of neat. And I loved how Newsday reached out to Greg Giannotti, who was a Belport alum, and a sports figure in sports radio to talk to him about it. So I thought that was really kind of cool this morning. So it'll be in tomorrow's Advance, and I think in a couple days it'll be in Newsday, so we'll see that. In your slide, you mentioned and I don't want to single out all the accolades from our athletes, but making All-State in any sport is extraordinarily, it's just really hard. For 2 football players to make first team All-State, I can't underscore how difficult that is and what an accomplishment that is. That's 2 out of 22 in the state that make that, and it's great at any level. The other players as well, a second team and a fifth team is an accomplishment as well. But first team is really remarkable. In regards to the Nassau Suffolk School Board, a couple of quick things. Like I said, we were at that event the other night, which I thought was very well done. It was great to be in a room with 53 other districts and it was nice that it was in conjunction with the Superintendent's Council. See a lot of people in the room, get to talk to a lot of people, get to see a lot of old friends, which was really nice. I wasn't really, I never really expect politicians to say much in that venue, and Mr. DiNapoli certainly didn't say not much, but he really was an engaging speaker, I thought. I enjoyed listening to some of his stories and things like that. I wish there was a little bit more substance. But again, I guess he couldn't have really said much anyway, so I should have known that going in. But it was a nice event. I do appreciate him being there. There was, it was brought up at that meeting, and so Ms. Felice and Mr. Santana obviously know about it, but there was a representative from the branch of the United States military. I think it was a general or a colonel, I can't remember. A couple of captains, all talking about recruiting and things like that. And Mr. Vecchio, the director at Nassau Suffolk School Board, had talked about this at the last meeting, and the stat, which gets worse every year, that we talked about at the table, and many people don't know. Nationwide, 73% of graduating high school seniors are ineligible for military service. And that's a stunning number. I remember being stunned when it was 60, 5, 6 years ago. And that's a national number. I actually did ask for regional numbers, because I'd be really curious to see regional and demographics to it. But some of us, I know when I was younger, the military was always looked at, "Hey, you got nothing going on, you didn't get to college, you need to get straightened out, we'll send them to the military, they'll straighten them out." The military standards have outpaced the education standards in our country. And that's something that the military is really trying to fix by partnering with school districts and making presentations, and they're doing assemblies about, hey, look what you can learn in the military, from whether it's software or mechanics. I mean, I have a family member who was a Marine in Afghanistan for 2 terms. He learned how to drive heavy equipment. He now has a very, very successful career with a construction company, and he makes a lot of money. He makes superintendent type money, which was stunning to me. So for those types of presentations to come to our schools, I think are important for kids to understand that aren't. And I know from personal experience, seeing a lot of kids, my own kid included, and some of his friends, decide that college isn't really for them. And I'm kind of stunned at the number of kids who are either not deciding not to go to college or to leave college early and look for a different path. That kind of stunned me. Even like there's some kids you kind of expect, you don't know if it's for them when they go. There's kids that I thought would have flourished that are now back home looking for other avenues, whether they're going to school, locally or not, whether it was away. I don't know if the pandemic had anything to do with it. I sense that it does, knowing from the own people that are close to me that have left. So thought that was kind of interesting to have other opportunities for kids to talk about. Another note on the NYSSBA front, obviously advocacy season is in full swing. I believe, I wasn't at the last meeting, did we distribute the legislative priorities for Nassau Suffolk School Board yet? Did you get them?
I don't recall getting those.
You should have them any day then, because actually they were in the
I just
packet.
received them this morning.
What's that?
I just received them this morning at the superintendent's meeting I was at.
You
I
did.
shared them with the board.
They were in the packet too at the meeting last week, so I'm kind of surprised we didn't get them electronically for distribution, but if we don't have them, just let me know and I'll find out what's going on. There were some trustees from the Nassau Suffolk School Board who are in Washington right now at the National School Board Association, so there's advocacy going on locally and nationally, which I thought was great. I'll have a little bit more detail when they get back in the next meeting. I can probably talk a little bit more about that in depth. And finally, one of the things that was interesting, we talked about at the last meeting, which was last week, a couple of districts, and full disclosure, this whole agreement bothers me, but it's probably a quick Band-Aid. A few districts have a service agreement with Northwell Health for mental health. It's a pathway to mental health providers. They're guaranteed a visit, an office visit. Now, there's some things I don't like about it. It comes at an expense, and that expense does not, that's on top of what the patient's insurance or out-of-pocket is as well. So they don't get any discounts or anything like that. But knowing the mental health crisis and how difficult it is to connect families and kids in need with mental health counselors and mental health needs, if there's any type of pathway that we should be exploring to help that, to alleviate that, I think it's something we should look into. Again, it kind of bothers me how they're double dipping here a little bit by charging districts and then charging insurance. But at the end of the day, if we can connect families with mental health counselors and the mental health that they need, I've done a lot of research on this, and I've been involved in this for a number of years now. And every now and then, on my own, just as a test, I will call my insurance carrier to find out where the nearest counselor is. And from my insurance, which I believe is the same as this district's insurance, because we talked about this, that part of that consortium, the nearest counselor for me is in Brooklyn. That takes insurance, that takes our insurance. And that's a major problem that we talk about. Everybody talks about more counselors, and all those things are true, but until the advocacy gets to insurance and who's covered and how you're covered and access to affordable mental health benefits, I think it's gonna be difficult. So anything we can do on that would be great. And one last question, and you don't have to answer it now, you probably don't have the answer, but in regards to, I know you give your COVID update, I'd be curious to see if attendance is not as good as we'd hope because of other illnesses. I know the flu was rampant. I have my own kids, I mean, if I count the last 2 months, I have one kid in the last 2 months who's missed 15 days of school. COVID, the flu, and then a COVID relapse, and now I've got another one home for 4 days, so.
So I can give an answer without hard data, so.
Yeah,
quote
and
me
I'm,
on it.
yeah, it doesn't have to be hard
No,
data.
it's not just COVID. I think people have been afflicted with flu, respiratory viruses, undisclosed ailments from, and this again is anecdotal when I speak to people, but I do think it's a function of us gathering again and exchanging germs. And I think our immunity took kind of a hit from our sort of isolation. And, that's just based on my limited science knowledge, but I'm hoping that, as the more time we spend with one another, the more our immunity will build. But yes, you're correct. It's not just COVID, it's been a whole host of different ailments. And in some cases, I've had people in my circle who have things that were never diagnosed. Not COVID, not flu, maybe a virus, but
Yeah, it's definitely strange. Like, I got one family, my oldest went to the clinic, to the walk-in clinic today. He doesn't have COVID, doesn't have the flu. He can't get his head off the pillow. Like, he's really sick, and the doctors, a lot's going on. So I just know there's a lot of kids out, so I'd be curious how negatively impacted, attendance really is.
Okay.
And that's all I got. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. All right, and I'll just close out the reports by thanking the superintendent for including the trustees on all of those events that we attended along with him. And then just add, as a result of the Brookhaven Elementary School third grade chorus, I was invited to visit with all the music classes that Mr. Costi teaches about a week after that, because it happened to be Brass Week, and he heard about my trumpet being reunited with my grandfather's antique trumpet that's nearly 100 years old, and he was introducing brass instruments that week. So he invited me to the class. I went to all 4 classes and had a remarkable day. One thing I learned, kindergarten and first graders all hug. And I was told by the teachers that sometimes would get you through the day, getting a hug from one of those students. And they were all receptive, and it was a remarkable experience. So I thank Dr. Raymond and her entire staff for creating the environment that she does at Brookhaven, because it was really remarkable. And I look forward to visiting other classes as I'm being requested now to bring this instrument, which is really a remarkable instrument and a remarkable story. And I thank the superintendent for encouraging that kind of learning with our students. So it's been great. Okay, we are on to public commentary. Do we have any cards? No cards. Okay. Items for discussion, board advisory. Items for discussion and action. We have 2 items. First is the board advisory committee meeting times. We did talk about changing those times. Some trustees have reached out to me that the 4:30 time doesn't work for them and would like it changed to 5:30 for those committees that they are on. I think we asked to the committees to survey. I don't know if we did that, or do we just want to make a decision to move our committee meetings to 5:30 to accommodate those? Yes, you had a question.
I have a comment.
Yes.
We were given a copy of the policy 2210, committees of the board. The way I read it is this policy is if the board had basically a committee of board members. I don't think that's the same as advisory committees. So I think that's one issue that may need to be addressed, is distinguishing between committees of the board and advisory committees. And also, I would echo what you said. I think since the advisory committees are really advisory to the board, I think that the members of the committee ought to be picking when they can best meet, so that they can maximize their attendance in order to give us the feedback we need.
it's one of the pitfalls of these start times is if you want participation from district employees, that gap between the end of their contractual day to 5:30 is pretty significant, especially if you don't live in the community. So that's kind of the balance you want to reach, because you also want to give access to the community members who work, typically people outside of schools work 9 to 5 jobs. So that's really the conundrum that we're in.
Yeah, if I can add too, so, you're right, it's what do you want, right? Because I can make an argument that, like, my participation years ago in committee meetings went away strictly because it was 5:30. That's too early for most people that don't work in schools. It doesn't mean you have, if you get out at 5, not everybody has a half an hour commute, and, it'd be nice to have dinner and see the family at some point. So I can make an argument that they should be even later at 7 o'clock. And I think, one of the, and if a committee is formed and it's decided amongst the committee to move up, maybe that's fine, because it works for everybody. But if you have 4:30 and now even 5:30 start times, it's going to prevent people from volunteering. And I think one of the things that I'm seeing since the inception of these committees is, it's really the same group of people being cycled through, and I don't know, that we're getting enough input from other stakeholders. And I don't know if this is a reason, but it might be. So I would like, I don't know what the answer is there, but if we have the same kind of people who are always involved, and we're not encouraging participation from people who've never been involved,
No, I understand
we're
your
losing
point.
perspective.
Just in response to like a 7 o'clock start time, again, these committees are volunteer. So I think it's a big ask to have employees, and some of our employees, especially if you work for a secondary school, you're done at 2:30 because you're starting at a little before 7 a.m. So you're almost like creating this scenario, and again, they don't meet that often, so I get that piece. But yeah, there's two sides of it. We want maximum participation. I think the participation, correct me if I'm wrong, I've stepped in the committees, I won't say for the full meetings the whole time. The participation's been pretty good in terms of district employees. You can speak to community members, but I know there is conflict. I know if you work and you have to commute, especially if you have to take Sunrise Highway, and 2 of our trustees have to navigate Sunrise on a daily basis, it becomes even difficult to get here at 5:30.
Say maybe there's a happy medium where they can have alternating times as well. As an
So
option.
maybe a suggestion, just make it an agenda item for the committee, and so they can have sort of a discussion among the committee members. And maybe it's not something that will be fixed. That's something that at the onset of the committees, in the beginning of the year, the committee, whoever volunteers, sort of comes to some consensus as to an ideal time. I think sometimes it's hard when you have like absolute starting times too, because there's so much variety in people's schedule.
Can you add to that consideration about having remote attendance also?
And with respect to community involvement, any name that was forwarded to me and I reached out to, they responded in kind. And most of those people either work from home or were retired, so had the availability to meet at the earlier times. Well, they've been attending the earlier times is really what I mean.
Yeah, I think what you're saying, if they can, the earlier time.
If they're retired, they can obviously
Make either time.
either time.
Or they may not want to drive that late, there's
No, I know,
all
but
those-
like I said, it's the flip side, right? If you're a parent that has kids in sports, you're on a field till 7 o'clock at night, till the sun goes down at 6 o'clock. So, and for me, like I said, I lean towards wanting more community involvement than not. And I would preference that there needs to be a healthy mix of parents of kids in school.
Well, we only
in-
have so many community spots on the committees to begin with.
Which I think is a problem, like I think there should be more.
Well, then
Yeah.
perhaps we need to look into redefining, those committees.
Well, I kind of brought that up at the beginning of the year, because I agree. I personally, I don't really agree with the structure, but I know nobody else has an issue with it, so I leave it alone. I mean, I know it's unpopular, I can make an argument that I don't believe board members should be on them, I think, because a board member shouldn't be on a committee that advises the board. That's my opinion, I know it's not shared by everybody, but it's one way of looking at it, right? Would we get, blind feedback that we weren't a part of if we weren't on the committee?
See, and I looked at the committees when I got on the board as a mechanism to see what fully goes on in the district, especially with regard to the Teach and Learn Committee, because I wasn't in education. And so I gained the most knowledge out of that committee. And so I always thought these committees were set up, for the board's convenience and input along with the committee members. So I had a different understanding of it, but if we need to relook at it, then we should do
Yeah.
that. But in the meantime, for the two committees that you're on, which are the two committees that you're on?
Teaching and learning and we would say it's a finance committee.
And the finance and
Yeah.
facilities meeting.
Finance and facilities.
And Cameron, you're two,
I have three. It's equity, health and safety, and strategic planning.
right, okay.
So if we stick with the 4:30 slot, I won't be able to really make any of the
Okay.
meetings.
So that's why I think it might help if we could grapple with what is it we're trying to achieve. If it's, I don't think it's the committee of the board, because these things are intended, like if there's a specific project or something that the board has to deal with,
Yes.
to have individual, several members of the board form a committee to do the work. We've got a separate thing, which is the advisory committee. And I too feel like I've benefited the way you did. I've gotten to know more about what goes on in the different departments and divisions within the district, and to have, a level of enhanced confidence that things are being addressed and, being handled, and they're just things that we don't know about because we don't have the expertise, but I get to hear about it. But I've also, and I've said this at board meetings before, I've also wondered if my presence as a board member can adversely impact feedback from employees or parents or members of the community who may be there. So I don't have the answers, I'm just throwing these out as things that I think need to be considered.
I agree with that last point. That's actually my number one, issue is, do staff members not want to speak freely and provide input in fear of having a contrasting opinion of a board member? I think it does happen. And I can go even like a little bit further. I have no business being on teaching and learning. I'm not a teacher. I can make an argument the only people that should be on the teaching and learning committee are people in education. And the other point, you made a comment too, like about how learning about different things in the district. I'm not so sure that's where we should be learning about and investigating what's happening in the district. So for me, I feel like the committees have kind of lost their purpose a little bit. And that's just, again, my opinion. And I think my guess is we could probably get a little bit more, or better substance out of, and that's not to say that there's not good stuff coming out, but I wonder if we would get more and get a little bit better information if board members weren't involved.
And following on that about my comment about learning about what's going on, if that was provided to us in a different way, perhaps with periodic presentations from the different areas, that could be taken care of there.
Well, in truth, the way we did it in the past, when we cut you off, like some committees early on would come to the board meeting and make a presentation on their findings. That was when we had a budget advisory committee, they'd done something like that, and that's what I think should be happening, so, sorry.
I think one of the things, I'm not too sure that these committees have like a mission statement. I know for our community resource network, formerly known as a community leadership network, that's kind of one of the charges that we said. Let's come up with a mission statement, a vision statement, so at the very least, we understand why we're meeting. For the leadership resource network, the resource network, it really, we finally came to the conclusion, it's more about creating awareness of all these resources that are, found within our district. And many times people are just unaware of each other's sort of agencies or organizations. So it's a great meeting ground, and that's pretty much the primary purpose of that committee, is to share what the different organizations that come visit us are doing for the community, which is, I think, fantastic and great. So maybe the idea is just to come up with sort of a mission statement. Here's the purpose of the committee. They said be informative, then you pick topics that you can talk about, whatever it is. And along those lines, also speak to the committee members about meeting times. And certainly I want to create a time that captures the most people. And certainly I don't want to put our staff in a position where, as much as I'm used to working very long days, it's a lot to ask, especially if you have families and you don't live in the community. You either have to drive home, drive back, or stick around for 13, 14 hours.
And I'll just make an additional comment to the experience of the different committees. And I've had a different experience than what Mr. Pacini explained. But to the point about feedback on the Leadership Network, which is now known as the Resource Network, and the charge to have the committee come up with a mission statement. Both myself and Vice President Hayes were at that meeting. We chose not to be on that subcommittee because we wanted to hear from the community at large as to what they want to see from that committee. So we did make a conscious choice that day to stay out of it so that we could get feedback from them. But the experience that I really value from and I'm going to point to the Teach and Learn Committee in particular, that's where we vetted Generation Citizen, that's where we vetted the Capstone program, that's where we vetted Seal of Civic Readiness, and to be able to recommend it to the board. So I think, maybe we do need to do a deeper dive into what these committees meant and what they're charged with, because I gained so much out of them, and I could speak to every other committee in the same way, as to how much I benefited from them because of the interaction. And my experience, unless I was just not aware of it, my experience was not that staff employees were inhibited by our presence. In fact, it was more of a supportive role, just like when we go, visit the schools and visit the classrooms. It's to be supportive of our education environment, not to stifle that kind of collaboration. So that's been my experience. So we'll talk more. We'll put it on our agenda committee meeting for the next time we meet, and we'll move this into whatever area it needs to be to give its full review. All right. Any other final comments before we move on to the budget presentation? All right, we're up to the budget presentation. Tax cap and revenues.
Thank you. I feel like this is prime time. All right. Here. Before we switch to full screen, again, I want to thank Jennifer Segee for her continuous work. One of the things I want to say about the budget presentation, and I want to say it before we go to full screen, is, and I'll talk a little bit about this during the presentation, is we wanted to create a presentation that feels like a lesson, because there's two parts to it. Number one, we obviously have to talk about the tax cap and provide a revenue overview. That's the subject of the presentation. But we want to educate the trustees and our community about the process and what these things mean. I think oftentimes, being on the other side of budget presentations and listening, there's a lot of numbers, there's the formulas, but I didn't always have a deep understanding of what any of this stuff meant. And so our goal, besides providing the information in a transparent manner, is really to be educated in that sort of process. So to that end, as I switch over to my presentation, I'm asking the board members to please save their questions to the end, because there is a flow to the presentation. The slides are numbered, so if you want to refer back to a slide, you can certainly just say, I have a question regarding slide 10, etc. But I'm going to get right to it. I'm very excited to present our second budget presentation entitled The Tax Cap and Revenue Overview. Again, I want to thank not just Ms. Segee for her assistance, but also the trustees for communicating sort of concerns and information they felt was important to communicate, and certainly the need for us to be as transparent as we can be. I'm going to begin with a summary of our scheduled budget presentation so that the trustees and the community knows where we're at in the process. Today is February 1st. We're going to be talking about the tax cap and revenue overview. Last time around, we talked about the budget process itself and some of our long-term planning plans. Again, the whole process is ongoing, so it's not like we develop a budget in February. That budget is going to be developed throughout the next couple of months, which culminates in April with our budget adaptation. And obviously the final sort of event is going to be our budget hearing, which is scheduled for May 3rd, and our budget vote and board election, which is scheduled for May 16th. To summarize, this is again a schedule of what we're going to be doing during this budget process timeline. Currently, we're kind of in between these two steps where we're looking at departmental budgets, staffing tables. We're sort of considering new program requests and also looking at areas that perhaps we can sort of cut, I hate to use the word cut, but programs that aren't necessarily that sort of fruitful for the school district. So decisions are being made in those regards. And of course, looking at our staffing requirements in terms of full-time equivalencies. And I want to emphasize that that process is somewhat different between secondary schools and primary schools. Primary schools, a lot of this is based upon enrollment and of course special programs. At the secondary schools, especially at the high school, it's based on course requests because we do individualized scheduling at the high school. Budget process recap. We have a lot of considerations we make in terms of developing a budget. Again, this is just a review. I'm not expecting anybody to read this, but the board's priority, which is the sixth priority, is to produce a transparent or to participate in a transparent budget process. To me, the most important consideration is that we do a budget process that both earns the confidence of the board and the trust of the community. In doing so, we reach out to different resources. Again, this is a summary that includes our peers in other school districts, resources that are available to us, like our auditors, both internal and external, our financial advisors. But we spend a lot of time making a lot of calls and consulting with different people because I think both Mr. Gee and I have the wisdom that we don't know it all. And so anytime we sort of make considerations, that we make sure that we consult as much as possible. And again, we're here to a budget process that kind of includes all these things that are listed. There's certain things that are fixed that we roll over one year to the next. But in reality, we want to build a budget, not necessarily from the ground up, because there are things that roll over that's out of control, but in considering what is it that the district needs, and differentiating between wants and needs, of course, and how can we kind of accomplish those things or put those things or implement those things without overburdening the taxpayers. And that's really the premise of the budget process. We want to minimize expenditures as much as possible, increase revenues wherever we can, and propose a budget that's palpable and doable for our community. So here we are today with the tax cap and revenue overview, which to me was probably one of the more complicated presentations we'll do in terms of the tax cap and the formula used to calculate that. So the essential questions for today's presentation, and I'm following a lesson format, is the tax cap. What is it? Is there a difference between the tax levy and the tax cap? How is it calculated? And what role does the tax cap play in the budgeting process? We're hoping to answer these questions throughout our presentation tonight. On the other side, we have revenue. What are the different funding sources that provide funding to schools so we can operate? To what extent does the school district have control over this revenue? And what is our anticipated revenue for the 2023-2024 school year? I want to emphasize, I want to make this emphasis throughout my presentation, that this is an ongoing process. So some of the numbers you'll see tonight are preliminary because we don't have the accurate data just yet. And you'll know exactly what I mean as I progress through the slides. Starting with the tax cap and tax levy, the property tax cap was imposed in 2012 in New York State. And it basically limited the tax levy increases to 2%. With consideration given to the rate of inflation and other variables. So the tax cap is not necessarily 2%, but rather a value that is determined by different factors. So there is a misconception that the tax cap is automatically 2%. I'll talk about a little bit about that. But 2% was kind of a point of reference that had to do with where inflation was for many years. Inflation tended to hover around 2%, a little below, a little above, and so they kind of came up with this estimate. One of the things I actually took away from the presentation by Comptroller DiNapoli was that the idea behind the tax cap was like kind of twofold. Number one, you want to protect the taxpayers from overtaxation. And on the flip side of it, you want to allow school districts to properly fund themselves and to account for rising costs that happen on a continual basis because of inflation and rising costs in general. So that's basically the purpose behind the tax cap, why it was implemented in 2012, and we're in the 10th year of sort of following this process. The tax levy, which is a term I feel like is used a lot, people don't really understand what it is. It's basically, as it pertains to school districts, it is a local property tax that's passed by the votes of the school district that generates revenue to fund programs and services that the state does not pay for as part of its basic education. That definition is a little misleading. So what that means is our entire budget is not just based on state aid. We get a certain amount of state aid, which we'll discuss with some specificity a little later. But there are other expenses that are not covered by state aid. And so basically, a big portion of our budget comes from property taxes and through the tax levy. So basically, it's the money that the school district receives that's voted on and approved by community members to help fund the operation of the school district. The tax levy limit, on the other hand, which is really the tax cap, with some exceptions, is the state's property tax limits, or rather, the state property tax cap limits the amount local governments and most school districts can increase the tax levy, which is the total amount of property taxes billed, to the lower of 2% or the rate of inflation. And this definition comes straight from the comptroller's office. But basically, it's the maximum amount a school district can ask from the community to vote on in terms of funding their school district. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the limit means in actuality in a couple of slides, but that's basically the difference. So the tax levy is the amount that school districts ask their communities to vote on. The limit is the maximum amount allowable without a supermajority. Like I said, I'm going to talk about that in more detail. So part of it is calculating the tax levy. Where does this figure come from? So there is a formula. This image is taken straight from the New York State Comptroller's Office. And basically the tax cap formula is broken up into 8 different distinct steps. The first 7 steps determines the tax levy limit without exclusions. I'm going to explain what exclusions are in a minute. This is the base formula. This determines the initial tax levy limit, or the maximum amount a school district can ask for without a supermajority vote. The 8th step on this process, which is kind of differentiated there, factors in exclusions, which determines the tax levy limit with exclusions. I'm going to explain what exclusions are a little later in the presentation. So again, the use of this formula, which we're going to go into detail, is basically mandated, not basically, but it is mandated by New York State, and all school districts are required to use it. So again, we calculate this tax levy limit by using the same formula. It's mandated by New York State. Here's the tax cap formula broken down in all of its sort of steps, using actual numbers as they pertain to our school district. So first point of emphasis is that all the components of the base formula, which is the first 7 steps of this formula, are pretty much fixed, meaning that the school district has no control over their values. And I'm going to go over each step in detail in subsequent slides. The second emphasis I want to put, and I kind of highlighted it there with the red arrow, is that the step 8, which adds exclusions basically enable school districts to increase their levy above the initial tax levy to account for certain costs resulting from capital expenditures, transportation, and BOCES capital expenditures, which is improvements made to BOCES facilities that we share the expense in. This is basically stuff that's unplanned and unforeseen that isn't part of like the regular operating budget of a school district. So the state basically says there are some exclusions in this formula because there are certain things that don't represent operating costs. Like for example, if there's a construction or a capital improvement project that needs to happen that we didn't anticipate, or we anticipate that we need to do, that's above and beyond our operating costs, this kind of gives you some sort of grace or some sort of slack to do those things. And again, proposed budget increases within the tax levy limit requires a simple majority. So let's say for argument's sake, the tax levy limit, not our tax levy, but the limit is 3%. If you propose a budget that's below 3%, you need a simple majority to pass it. If you propose a tax levy limit, a tax levy above the tax levy limit, that requires a supermajority vote for it to be approved. So that's basically the function of that limit. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the impact it plays, because I think it's important to emphasize that the tax levy limit doesn't drive the budgeting process. And I'm going to explain what that means in a subsequent slide. So let's first talk about steps 1 and 2. That's called the tax base growth factor. Here they are. Those are the amounts you see. So the first step includes the basically the value there is the value of our previous year's tax levy, which is $65 million, a little over $65 million. So that basically, this first step in this calculation is to indicate what our tax levy was for the prior year. The second step is to multiply that figure by the growth factor. And the Tax-based growth factor is basically, if I don't define it, measures a change in the amount of tax rolls in comparison to the prior year. The tax-based growth factor is basically provided to us by the New York State through their website. This is not a figure that we developed, it's a figure that's given to us. So when you multiply our previous year's tax levy, which is $65 million and change, with the growth factor, it gives you this new value that's going to play into this formula. So moving on to steps 3 and 4, which are the payments in lieu of taxes, otherwise known as pilots. And here they are. These steps include 2 steps to yield yet another figure and as part of the calculation. First, step 3, that represents the pilot payments for the current school year. The reason I'm saying current school year is because it's the year that we're in right now. That's the amount of money we receive from pilots in this current year. In terms of budgeting, it's the prior school year, because we're planning for next year's budget. So I want to kind of make that distinction so you don't get confused that this is the prior year, meaning last year. It's actually the current value. So currently, the school district receives a little bit over $8 million in pilot payments. And then you're going to see when we talk about exclusions, there was a $3.5 million exclusion that was included in the tax levy. You subtract that from that number. That's part of the formula. So here's step 4. This value represents the total sum of our capital tax levy exclusion from our current school year, which is what our current exclusion was, or the prior year, we're referencing next year's budget. Okay? Those 2 figures are fixed from last year for our current year's budget. So again, it goes into the calculation. That brings us up to the $70 million figure you see there, just underneath step 4. Step 5, it's its own step, it's the growth factor. And the growth factor, as you can see here, is 1.02. That actually represents 2%. Okay? So step 5, the growth factor is based upon 2% or the rate of inflation, whichever is the lower value. Okay? So that's where we get this 2% in this formula from as the growth factor. This basically, we get this information, or we make this determination on whether we're using 2% or something different based on the chart provided by the Comptroller's Office. So the rate of inflation, basically, and it's been hovering a little less than 8%. There's been times it's been as high as 8%. It's been as low as 3%. But the point of my story is it's been over 2%. So that means that we have to use the 2% growth factor, because you're supposed to use the lower of the 2. So, so again, that's where you multiply that latest figure by 1.02. That brings up to the $71 million figure that you see on the screen. And so again, we're using the 2% as a growth factor because it's basically lower than the current rate of inflation. Step 6 and 7 are the current year pilots and the carryover. So I'll talk about, and here they are. And so basically, at this point, now we're subtracting. Up to this point, we've been adding values. Now we're subtracting. So step 6 is the current year's pilots. I'll say that. So that's basically the 2023-24 total estimated from pilot agreements. Then step 7 is basically when the total property taxes levied is less than the levy limit of the prior year. So in other words, the district's ask is less than the limit. A school district is permitted to carry over all or a portion from the prior year based on the calculation. So the amount you see there, it's $344,000, is basically the maximum available carryover that can be applied to this year's tax cap calculation, tax levy limit calculation. So that brings down the tax levy limit before exclusions to $64 million and change. These are the first 7 steps. That is the tax levy limit without exclusions. That's the dollar amount. And then we go down to step 8, which are the exclusions. And the chart here shows you all the figures and all the steps that we just went over, but now I want to emphasize our exclusions. And we have 2 scenarios, which I'm going to explain the difference between the 2 scenarios so that the trustees are clear and the community is clear. Step 8, the capital exclusion is basic. The capital exclusion, basically, which is the exclusions, is the only calculation impacted by internal factors that occur within a school district. Bond payments, transfer to capital, energy performance contracts can all basically be noted as an exclusion. And I'm going to show you examples of those things specifically. So those exclusions are there precisely because you can add those increases to account for unforeseen things that are not part of the normal operation of the school district, like debt service payments, capital improvements, and energy performance contracts. And again, the exclusion allows for districts to increase their levy above the initial levy limit, which is calculated by the first 7 steps, again, because of costs associated with capital improvements or things that are above and beyond our operating expenses. To talk to you about it more specifically, when we look at the exclusions, and I want you to focus on scenario A, those are our standard exclusions. There's no changing those values. So basically, it's a debt service payments for capital projects. That's basically, we have a service payment currently of $7 million. And then we have the share of BOCES rent and capital expenditures. That figure represents our share of expenses, all school districts share Eastern Suffolk BOCES expenses within their school budgets. Those 2 numbers are fixed. Those 2 numbers are out of our control. The capital, the $3 million, $3,700,000 figure there that you see is part of the tax levy revenue, and that's based on the differential between, or actually the building aid we're receiving for the capital projects that we received in this current year. So just to make that clear, you minus that revenue you're receiving in building aid when you're developing what your exclusion is going to be. So when you look at scenario A, the exclusion, total for the exclusion is $3.8 million based on those figures that are in scenario B. I'm sorry, scenario A. What makes scenario B different is that we added interfund transfer to capital line. What this is basically a capital line that enables a school district to engage in much needed capital improvements on an ongoing basis that generates revenue in the form of building aid. What we mean by this is that there's only 3 ways in reality that the school districts can engage in capital improvements. Capital improvements are improvements to the structure or the buildings of the school district. We're not talking about maintenance, we're talking about upgrades or construction. The 3 ways are bonds, capital reserve votes, because we have a capital reserve fund that's dedicated to capital improvements that requires a vote from the public. The 3rd way is to have an interfund transfer to capital line embedded in the district, because what that does is it enables us to, whatever that figure is, it enables the school district to engage in capital improvements that will be state approved and aidable on an ongoing basis. This generates state aid on an ongoing basis too. So in the first year, if we should adopt the capital transfer line, you would generate state aid at 76.2%, spread out over 15 years. And each subsequent year, you keep adding to that building aid. When we talk about capital projects or improvement projects that might be critical to us here in Bellport, you know, we've all seen that the Bellport High School auditorium stage needs updating, our lighting systems, our girls' locker room needs to be expanded to increase equity, track drainage, system replacement, track upgrades, repairs. There's a whole host of things that can be captured in this interfund transfer line that we can immediately start doing. And that serves 2 really important purposes. The first important purpose, the buildings need these fixes. Anybody, I keep saying this, anybody who owns their home or has been in one location for a long time, things start falling apart. And if you don't continually upgrade them or address those concerns, you get to a position where, you know, the costs just skyrocket because you didn't do it in a timely basis. So again, this allows us to do sort of smaller projects that don't require a capital reserve vote or a bond. It doesn't replace the need for capital reserve votes or bonds, but certainly allows us to do ongoing capital improvements and create revenue in subsequent years. The interfund transfer to capital, as important as it is for our administrative thing, and I think it's something that the board really should consider, one limit. As you see here, in scenario A, the tax levy limit is $3.4 million roughly, and it's changed by $1 million to $4.4 million on scenario B. What I want to say, and what I want to emphasize, that this does not necessarily increase the district's proposed budget or our tax levy that we're going to ask for, because the budget process works independently of the tax cap or tax limit, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So just to sort of talk a little bit more about the exclusions or their anticipated tax levy, under scenario A, which does not include interfund transfer, our percent or our anticipated tax cap or tax levy limit would be 3.12%. So this is without this interfund transfer line added. Under scenario B, that tax levy limit would be 4.64% with the $1 million interfund line added, and that's noted in the bottom of this graph over here. The reason we decided to show or these two scenarios is because we want to be transparent. When we talked about adding a interfund transfer line, our intention was not that it would increase the tax levy limit. It's because this is a great mechanism we can use to make these much needed improvements and also generate income in future years. So I'm going to make a couple clarifications. First, the tax levy limit does not represent the district's proposed tax levy. I think that's a very common misconception. So if we were to adapt scenario B and go in that direction, that does not mean the school district is going to be asking for a budget increase of 4.6%. Not at all. Second point of clarification is that the budget process functions independently from the tax levy limit. So in other words, let's say we end up at 4.6% tax levy limit, we're not going to work around that tax levy limit. We're going to produce a budget that's going to be as flat as possible. What we want to do is, again, minimize expenditures and in whichever ways possible, maximize revenues. So I want to emphasize to the trustees and the community members who are here or who are listening, we don't use either one of these limits to drive our budget process. We're going to do the budget process in a transparent manner, and we're going to land where we need to land. And last point of clarification, it is not our expectation at all to propose a tax levy limit that demonstrates an increase that's going to equal or surpass either one of these limits, the 3% or the 4%. We don't see us asking for a tax levy limit or a budget increase that's going to approach those numbers. Because again, when we sort of engage in this budget process, we're doing it following a clear process and not with these tax caps in mind. And it is our expectation that we will fall somewhere below even scenario 3, including that interfund transfer to capital. So that's basically kind of the synopsis of the tax cap, this calculation. Right now we're contemplating two scenarios. One scenario does not include an interfund transfer to capital, which enables us to do ongoing capital improvement projects. We would come in at 3.12 tax levy limit in that scenario. The other scenario, scenario B, that includes this interfund transfer to capital, enabling us to do this capital improvements, that tax cap would come in at 4.64%. So I'm going to move on now, and I'll take questions at the end with our revenue side of this presentation. So how are school districts funded? What are our revenue sources? This is somewhat more simpler. We just talked about the tax levy and property taxes. Well, property taxes account for about 48.1% of our budget. The next largest source of revenue is our state aid, which is at 40.1% of our budget. We have other revenue, and I'll explain what other revenue comes from in the future side, and our appropriated fund balance. That's basically the fund balance of monies left over that are used to help offset costs in the subsequent year's budget. So I'm going to begin with, we already talked about the tax levy. State aid is our next big source of revenue, and this is hot off the press. I don't expect anybody to read the figures on there, so we broke them down. But this afternoon, the governor released the executive proposed budget, and here are the actual numbers from that proposed budget. And I want to make an emphasis that this is a proposed budget. This budget is going to go to legislators. They're going to sort of pick it apart, and at some time before April, they'll make a final determination as to what the budget's going to look like, and especially what our state aid would be. But in this initial run of the proposed state executive budget, if you look, we're looking at about a 7% increase in state aid based on this initial proposal. This number, in all likelihood, may shrink as the legislators go in, but certainly we don't think it's going to go below zero, and we do expect that there's going to be an increase in state aid. Whether or not it's going to be close to the 7% figure, we can't make that calculation now, and I certainly don't want to predict the future. But we can say with a certain amount of confidence that we will get an increase in state aid for the 2023-24 school year. So those are the actual numbers based on this report that came out at about 2 p.m. this afternoon. So we're very fortunate to have the time to kind of incorporate it into our presentation. Other revenue includes, of course, pilots, but miscellaneous revenue is what is a little more gray, but I wanted to include different types of revenue sources that fall into that category. In scenario A, again, these numbers are in the current school year, that represents about $1.4 million. That's day school tuition, health services, interest and earnings from our bank accounts, Medicaid reimbursements. E-rates are kind of rebates we get for some of the programs we use that we get from BOCES. They basically give us a check in the form of a rebate for different services we use, rental income, and donations. There could be a year where a philanthropist decides to donate a big portion of money to our school, and that suddenly becomes part of our revenue source. So if somebody decided to donate $1 million to South Country School District, it certainly becomes a part of our revenue source. So that's where the miscellaneous revenue comes into play. The reserves here, the use of the reserves, are basically used to offset expenditures in a very deliberate manner because the reserves are restricted. So we can only use it for those purposes, for the TRS. And again, the values from the fund balance and the reserves are approximations because we're at the very beginnings of the budget process. So those numbers are subject to change as we engage in the budget process, including the figure we use for our state aid, because again, that figure is based on the proposed executive budget, and that will be finalized in the next couple of months. And the reason we're using reserves to, again, offset some of our costs is this is one of the ways we're going to mitigate the discrepancy we have in our debt payments and our building aid, and to sort of manage the gap that we're going to have for the next couple of years. So again, it's very deliberate, it's very sort of thought out, and that's basically sort of a synopsis of revenue. And correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Agee, the reserves aren't technically revenue, but it's monies that we use to offset expenditures. So in a way, for layman's terms, it's kind of money that we're using. So it's sort of revenue, but from an accounting perspective, not revenue. Moving on, I want to give a quick review of everything I discussed today. First and foremost, the tax cap is based on legislation adopted in 2012 to both protect the taxpayer and enable school districts to be properly funded. The tax cap is based on an 8-part formula mandated by the State Comptroller's Office. Most of the formula contains values that are fixed. This calculates the initial tax cap or tax levy limit. Exclusions can also be factored in, which calculates the tax levy limit with exclusions. And again, those exclusions are those unforeseen costs, capital improvements that are above and beyond our operating costs. The anticipated tax levy for the South Country Central School District, including an intrafund transfer to the capital, will be 4.64%. Without the intrafund transfer to capital, will be 3.12%. So again, in the effort to be fully transparent, I wanted to propose both scenarios to the trustees to have an open discussion as to which is the best course of action. Having said that, the anticipated tax levy limit for the South Country Central School District does not represent the anticipated tax levy increase. I can't emphasize that enough. We're not going to be asking our community for either one of these numbers. We don't know what we're going to be asking for because we have to finish the budget process. We can say with a certain amount of certainty that we're not going to be asking for a budget increase that surpasses even the 3% number just based on our initial calculations. So I will say that with confidence. And again, the difference between surpassing the tax levy limit, if we ever got to that point in our district, is that anything above that limit requires a supermajority vote. Anything below it requires a simple majority vote. If you're curious, when does any district ever pierce the tax levy limit? There have been times where the tax levy limit has been negative. So imagine trying to operate a school where the tax levy limit, because of the inflation, it's really low, is actually negative after your calculations, which means you almost are forced to make cuts unless you pierce that cap. We're not in that situation, so I don't want to alarm anybody, but I just want to give you a for instance as to when a school district may consider piercing the tax levy limit cap. The tax levy limit or cap does not factor in to the budget process. I want to emphasize that again. The goal is to propose a tax levy increase that meets the needs of the district without overburdening the taxpayer. I cannot emphasize that enough. And finally, above and beyond property taxes, school districts are funded by state aid, pilots, and miscellaneous sources. We'll do our due diligence to really try to, affect an increase in revenue sources as much as we can by advocating with elected officials, reaching out to community organizations, and we'll do that on an ongoing basis with the goal of producing a balanced budget, hence the scale. And that concludes my presentation. I want to go over again the schedule. At our next board meeting, that'll be February 15th, we're going to start talking about expenses and some of the operating costs of the district. Specifically, we'll be talking about the general support, operation and maintenance, security and utilities, transportation, employee benefits, debt service, fund transfer, and capital expenditures. That's for our next budget presentation scheduled for February 15th. And at this point, I want to open the floor for questions.
Okay. Who would like to begin?
Can I make a comment?
Go right ahead.
I am thrilled to see that transfer, the interfund transfer to capital. I'm learning what you call it. And in my layperson's language, it would be we've got a line in there for doing capital work that absolutely has to be done on an annual basis. And I'm happy to see that there.
And I just want to comment on your comment real quickly. I don't mean to interrupt. One thing I didn't mention during the presentation is the $1 billion seems like a monumental number. At least to me it does. But it represents less than 1% of our overall budget. So when I say that adding that line to our school budget doesn't really affect the budgeting process, is there ways that we can adjust different expenditures and the way we operate that we can almost absorb that cost without overburdening the taxpayer? So again, what we're asking for is an amount that amounts to less than 1% of our overall budget. Please continue, I'm sorry.
But by having it in there on an annual basis, it gives the district the flexibility to do some of the work that we know is critically important. It also saves us money in a couple of ways because, as you pointed out, it creates the 76.2% state aid to come back over a period of time. And it avoids the cost of borrowing if we were to have to do it, because anytime we borrow, even though we really, really like our new financial advisors, they get paid money every time they place borrowing for us. So I'd rather have that money available to get new windows at Vern Critz or, to do the work in the high school gym or the locker rooms. So thanks so much for putting that in there.
Trustee Pacino.
The interfund transfer to capital, that budget line, that's basically what it's just a budget line, right?
Right.
Is there a limit to it? Or it's just whatever our budget can tolerate? Like if we're flush in 3-5 years down the road, we can do $1.5 million or $2 million, there's no limits to it, right? Not to say that we will.
So we considered that. So we felt like the $1 million figure is a reasonable figure, it's enough. But considering, the next 5 years, we didn't want to be over ambitious with this because we sort of got to consider, again, the challenges that we spoke about in the last presentation. We felt the $1 million figure was something that was doable. It allows us to do enough. Obviously for some of the more substantial projects, we want to consider a capital reserve vote because again, that money is sitting there and that's a budget neutral sort of expenditure. And maybe down the line, and I don't want to say this in public, but I'm about to, consider a bond because school districts need bonds. So we're not there yet, so I don't want to sort of put that out there or have me quoted as saying that I'm proposing a bond in a year or two. But certainly, I think it's important to engage in ongoing capital improvements.
Understood. So, and I agree. I think it's a safe number for now. Like I said, I'm curious about the future. And to your point, yes, we will need a bond. I mean, that's the reality of it at some point, and we probably should have done it. But COVID kind of got in the way of everything, so it probably would have happened by then. My question is on the reimbursement from the state aid. How does having a budget line be reimbursed? How is that impacted by the backlog in, authorization from the state to do the work versus the materials and everything else that's plaguing school construction right now?
So it's like a multifaceted question. So basically, any project we engage using that line in the budget, we're going to get state approval for, because otherwise you don't get the state aid. So obviously you would work with architects or facilities director to make sure we're aligned. I think the point you were trying to make is just the response time from the state or the.
Yeah, we know there's one person, I think it might be two now,
Two.
that approve all of these projects across the state. And we know that
So-
approvals are taking a long time.
So correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Gee, so once a project is approved, let's say it's approved in the 23-24 school year, even if that project's not completed the following year, we still can use those funds to finish the project, is that correct? So the funding doesn't come until the projects are completed. So here's a thought, because I talked about this actually with trustee Trent, because in the first year, 76, you gotta remember this, we're not gonna get 76% in one shot. It's spread over 15 years, right? Full transparency. 76% of $1 million is $750,000. $760,000, but we're gonna make it a little simple, $750,000. You divide that by 15, and I think the figure we came up with is somewhere around $50,000, I think.
50,800.
Thank you, trustee Kavanaugh, right? So in that first year of reimbursement, that's what we're gonna receive. We're gonna receive approximately that $50,000 amount in that 1 year as state aid. If we do this 2 consecutive years, that amount goes up to $100,000. The third year, $150,000. You see where I'm going with this?
No, I am.
Yeah.
I get it. So to that end, the next question then is, $1 million seems like a lot of money, but when you're spending that in a school for construction, that is next to nothing,
You're absolutely right.
right? Because, and I can point to the fence at Vern Critz, right? If I called the local fence guy, he would have fenced in Vern Critz for probably $15,000, because I priced it out. We paid $96,000 because we have to pay the prevailing wage through Eastern Suffolk BOCES, so everything costs about 5 times more than it should if we weren't a school.
So these are, and that's, you make an excellent point. I have another, for instance, in my former school, we wanted to redo one of the boys' bathrooms, and it was just in disrepair. Our custodial staff said, we'll fix it, we'll get the tiles, and the cost was minimal. I promise you, the cost was minimal. We had to go to bid, and ultimately the cost to redo that bathroom was something like 60 grand. And so that's a reality we face, and that's why you have to kind of pick and choose which projects you're gonna do. We feel with a certain amount of confidence that the $1 million will capture projects that are not gonna be as extensive as we might like. I'll give you, for instance, windows at Vern Critz. That's been a topic of discussion in this district for a while now. The estimated cost for that project, and I'm gonna ask the trustees to sort of correct me if I'm wrong, is about $2 million. 2.4 maybe? Okay, so let's say it's 2.4. So something like that is something that you would capture in a like capital reserve vote or a bond project. We're talking about enhancing the locker room for our female athletes so that it's more equitable. Upgrades, and again, we're not talking about maintenance. Maintenance is not state aidable. But upgrades to our drainage system so we can maintain our fields in better condition. All these little projects that we would get together and sort of prioritize that fit within that $1 million budget that we can do just to generate this revenue and to do these improvements. I still do think that we're probably gonna have to contemplate another capital reserve vote to take care of the windows at Critz. I know that's a priority for the district, and some other things that, will come up. But based on our building condition survey, there's a lot of repairs that need to be made. And the idea is how do you kind of create a schedule of repairs or upgrades or capital improvements in a manner that's sort of palpable to us in terms of our budget process and things we can manage, and palpable to our community when we ask for a vote. And whether we ask for a vote to use our capital reserve funds, or we ask for a vote to propose a bond, that's something I think we should contemplate very deeply. But again, $1 million, and I'm glad you made that point, from the school district's perspective, is not a lot of money. Things cost a lot of money. But we may be able to, upgrade the high school's auditorium, for example. Their lighting system and sound system, it's not that it's in disrepair, but it's antiquated. Or safety concerns or different things, like I said, the drainage system. We would love to have a TV studio in our high school. That's one thing I think is missing. When you have a TV studio and a TV program, that leads to a lot of CTE education opportunities and involvement for students. That's something that maybe, that would be a capital project, so.
I'd like to see some upgrades to some, like, a lot of quality life thing, and everything is valuable, right? But like, you walk into some of these bathrooms that were designed in the 50s, it's like, can we have appropriate facilities? Can we have modern and updated, science labs and, common spaces and things like that. So while lighting in the stage is important for our productions and things like that, I just want to make sure that the board's discussion is part of the discussions as to what the work's going to be, because, like I said, right, if you ask anybody, bathrooms is always number one, right? And in any district, right? Like I have a friend, you know what, it'd be great, I walked in a vote, I used the bathroom, what am I voting for? Why do I have to look at this, you know what I mean? So those are things I think that make impact, and they create community trust, I think, when they say I'm paying my tax dollars, at least where my kids are going to school is upgraded, it's modern, it's fresh, and things like that, where I don't think everybody will
so-
see some things.
Sort of the samples we use are just examples. Obviously, we would have a discussion because, again, you were the bridge between the community and the school district, so you're gonna get input. We're gonna get input from our stakeholders on the inside, and you have to really just prioritize. But yeah, it's, the $1 million is not a monumental amount of money, but I do think we can capture a lot of projects that will improve quality of life, safety, and all those things that we talk about.
Oh, I was just gonna say that we have the building condition survey that is multiple pages long, that is full of things that we need to get done urgently. And I think we can just chip away at that with this transfer line.
Yeah, and that's kind of like the purpose behind it. And the reason, we contemplated just kind of talking about our tax levy limit with the transfer line included and just presenting that to the board. But I felt that'd be a little disingenuous because that transfer line does impact the tax levy limit. So I said, to be transparent and honest, here are the two things we're considering. And I can speak for my administrative team, we totally are recommending including this line because it's, for number one, to trustee Trent's point, we need these repairs. We need to start doing them as quickly as possible. We already have the fire burning under our capital reserve vote that we just passed in October. That's going to, replace the turf field and upgrade our locking mechanisms and our camera systems. Much needed repairs. I'm glad that's underway, but there's still more work to be done.
So to that end, to that point, I do think that even though it might not be the right time to really start investigating a bond, it really is time to start planning it, because I kind of believe that, the previous board, pre-COVID, I understand the plan was kind of to start around that time, nobody saw COVID coming, but at the same time, I don't really know why we waited if we knew it was coming to at least start the wish list and really kind of what it looks like, so that when the time does come, and maybe it's 2 years, maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's next year, I don't know. But I'd really like to know that we're ready with what we can justify to the community really needs to be done, because I think it's gonna be a long conversation. I don't think it's certainly not something after the last budget season I wanna spring on the community, hey, next year we're going for a bond.
Agreed.
So I'd really like to see a long-term, and not even long, but, medium-term plan for what we wanna get done, so then we can determine how we bring it to the community and if they're gonna trust us enough to follow through based on
I
last
probably
year.
know this off the top of my head. I'm asking a quick question. The last bond that the school district passed was, what, 15 years
Well, it's the
ago?
ones that are giving us the problem right now,
Yeah.
15 years ago.
About 15 years ago. So yeah, again, over 15 years, things start kind of falling apart.
Yeah, and one of the, to bring it up, one of the biggest issues with that bond was they did everything at once.
Correct.
It could have been, done over a course of time, so we don't have to redo everything at once. So that's why, for me, that's why I'm thinking to myself, we're certainly not gonna go out for a $110 million bond and do everything at once, but all those jobs that were done are the same age now. So if we don't start proactively getting some things done now, like, we have to do it in a way that the community's gonna be able to stomach. Whether it's multiple mounds over a certain amount of time, or however it works, but I would hope that starts like the day after the budget passes this year.
Can we just continue around the horseshoe for others who have
Trustee
questions?
Hayes?
I don't
sorry.
have a question, I just wanted to reiterate, just for clarification purposes, that this $1 million we're talking about does not represent a $1 million increase in the school's budget.
No.
It is simply an internal transfer from one fund to another that gives us the opportunity to generate some state aid going forward,
Sagi?
correct?
Well, it's in the budget, so what do you mean that?
I'm just saying that we're not asking for an additional $1 million in
It's
our
gonna be
budget.
part of all the costs that we're gonna be adding together. It's gonna be added with the salaries, the benefits, we're gonna ask for it.
So-
But
Well, I
what
understand
I'm
your
saying is
question. I
that
understand
we're
your
not
question.
increasing our budget, our last year's budget by
Right.
$1 million.
Yes, yes.
Not increasing the
Yeah.
expenses.
That's correct. It's money that's already in the budget, moving from one line to another line for the purpose of
Yes.
generating state aid.
Yes.
Okay.
Trustee Flippin, did you have any other questions? Okay, trustee Barry.
The only thing I had to do is, I think this is a good community service to our community to start to really educate them. So I definitely applaud, the methodology behind this presentation in order to inform and educate, because I think it goes a long way. Even if nobody is paying attention or this small group in the room, they can go back and look at this process, and I think that's so far so good.
I appreciate that. Thank you, trustee Barry.
And Vice President Hayes had an additional
I
question.
wanted to add on to what trustee Puccini said about some of the lessons we've learned from 15 years ago and how if budgets are done and bonding is done in relatively small chunks, the small bond generates your cash flow in subsequent years. That didn't happen because of the way this was structured 15 years ago. So I think we've learned a lot, become a lot more sophisticated about budgeting in school districts, and I'm pretty confident in saying this board's not going to repeat what was done a long time ago. So I like hearing the line item that you're adding. I also wonder if you can, because you did comment too about capital reserve funds, and ours, we still got about $2 million left in the existing one, I believe, and Ms. Gay says
Yes.
that's about right. And I'm sure you could find a good use for that. And the public would be supportive of it, I believe, because it would be budget neutral, because it's money that's sitting there to be used for capital
And the way
purposes.
that would work, just for the sake of the community and the trustees, is if we engage in the capital reserve vote, we would also have to vote to fund the capital reserve again. Is that correct, Cindy?
We would establish a new capital reserve because the other one is fully funded. So we can
we
establish
have
a
to go
new
for
one,
another
but we
vote.
could vote on expending the one that we currently have.
So there's I'm hearing like 3 different layers here. You've got your line item, which is your
Fund transfer.
interfund transfer to capital. We've also got use of money that's in the existing capital reserve fund. And then if the voters would approve what we're spending it on. And in addition, the possibility at some appropriate time of creating a new capital reserve fund, and that would take voter approval.
Correct.
No, I'm sorry. I thought that creating a new capital reserve fund would just require board approval, but to spend the money that the board decides to put in it, the community has
Voters
to.
have to vote to approve establishing a capital reserve.
Okay,
So it's
got it.
2 votes. It's a capital reserve, establishing it,
establish
and then
it.
and then to spend it.
So we don't need voter approval to put money into the fund.
Right.
Okay, got it.
After this fund is established.
After
After the
Yeah,
fund's
yeah, yeah.
established, then we can fund it.
So, okay, I'm sorry.
So you have one more question?
I do.
Okay, you go, and then I'll finish up after you.
Do we determine in here, or did I miss it, where the transfer's coming from, the interfund transfer?
It comes from the general fund, which is what we're voting on. It goes from
Okay.
the general fund, and then we transfer it to the capital fund.
Okay, but, so are we going to, so the general fund, it's specifically coming from the general fund, right? So, but it's not coming from TRS and ERS budget lines, we're not underfunding them to backfill this. Okay, so then what does that reduce the general fund to?
Various things, we're working on that now.
Okay, so we're gonna see what,
Yes.
because at some point, like, so are we also somewhere else in the budget line funding the general fund?
The general fund is what we're voting on. It's the whole budget.
Okay, all right, I'll come back to the next meeting and I'll ask the question differently, because I'm not, go ahead, sorry.
When you start talking about expenses, to Mr. Pacini's point, maybe we can talk about the section in the audit that refers to the general fund and the differential of what we had left over.
Yes.
Because that's ultimately where the money's going to be coming from. So maybe we can just point to that to highlight the value of our audit, because it identifies where we do have the extra money that we put in our reserves, the extra money that we have, for the fund balance.
Yep.
But I think that's important to talk about as we move forward. What my comments for the superintendent was, your presentation was about 40 minutes long, which was very comprehensive. And I appreciate that you took input from all of the Board of Trustees before you presented tonight. You asked for feedback, you showed us the presentation ahead of time, you showed us where you wanted to tweak certain things, you took input from all of us as to what we wanted to see because of what we experienced last year, and you came up with the presentation that you did tonight, which I think covered everything we needed to cover about the tax cap, because it is so confusing, and the tax levy, and that the two do have different definitions. But what was really striking to me is how you emphasize that we have to work kind of backwards. We can't decide what we need to spend before we know where we need to land. And that's all based on mandates from New York State. In fact, the reason we have to come up with the tax cap and the tax levy limits beforehand is because you have a requirement of March 1st to report this to New York State. And so that has to get done first, before we even know what kind of state aid is coming down.
Right.
So for the public to understand that that's the challenge of school districts, that we have so many unknowns as we start this project, as we start the process, I mean. But I think you explained it in a way that's going to be very helpful to the community. And I know the time that you took to put into this presentation.
Not just me, Mr. Gee as well.
Well, and your whole cabinet. I mean, everybody was
Absolutely.
charged. And the one thing I like that you said is if we've been around to the different concerts and building tours, that you're encouraging staff, rank and file staff members, ask for what you need. The answer isn't going to be an automatic no. Let's see what ideas you have, because to the conversations that have been happening around the table, let's make a long-term plan. So if it's not feasible for this particular budget or this particular school year, maybe it's something that has to go down the road, and certainly the long-term planning that we learned from previous budgets as to how to do it better. And I think you set us on the path to how to do it better.
Correct. And again, it's not just, what people need, it's also what you can do without. It's a give and take. So the process goes both ways. So, but I think it's important to hear these ideas. And even if we can't make them happen here, sometimes it's worth listening to, because if it's something that's not palpable or something that we can't accomplish, we may be able to accomplish something slightly different that accomplishes the same goal, if you know what I mean. So I think the conversations are important. I've worked in districts where, they'll just say, flat budget, give me your building budget, I don't want any increases. And that was like the whole conversation. I don't think that's a fruitful conversation, because I want to know what the buildings need, and I need to hear it from not just the trustees and community members, but certainly from my stakeholders. And again, it's not about saying yes, because you can't say yes all the time, but certainly being mindful of what the needs are, and to your point, thinking long-term.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Just one more
Oh,
thing.
sure.
The PowerPoint there'll be a link to that on the district website?
Yeah, the whole presentation will be posted, so you can hear my voice. And we'll also print the presentation as well.
Okay.
It looks a little weird in the PDF format, because the animations are weird, but the information's there.
Great, thank you.
All right. Thank you all.
All right, thank you. All right, we'll give the superintendent a chance to settle in, but when we begin again, we'll be up to item G.
All right, so, see, the administration recommends approval of curriculum items reflected in schedules G1 through G2.
Okay. Need a motion and a second for G1 and 2. Can I have a motion? Motion by trustee Kavanaugh, seconded by, anybody? Trustee Flippin? Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of G1 and 2? Seeing all hands raised, the motion passes unanimously. Now we are up to consent item H, personnel.
Administration recommends the approval of personnel changes reflected in schedules H1 through H8.
Was that eight, did you say?
8.
Okay. H1 through 8. We need a motion and a second. Motion by trustee Kavanaugh, seconded by trustee Barry. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor, please raise your hands. Seeing all hands raised, the motion passes unanimously. Now we're up to item I, consent agenda item for business.
The administration recommends approval of business items reflected in schedules I1 through I6.
Okay. Need a motion and a second for I1 through I6. Motion, please. Motion by trustee Flippin, seconded by trustee Kavanaugh. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor, please raise your hands. Seeing all hands raised, the motion passes unanimously.
I'm
That
sorry,
brings-
President Trees, I did have a question.
Oh, certainly, sorry.
Mr. Santana, item 6, on the items we just approved, are we replacing those equipment, the pieces of equipment that are being discarded?
I can't answer that off the top of my head. I would have to look into it. It all depends on whether it's attrition, meaning we don't, the equipment is not functional, so we don't need it anymore. But I can find out.
Well, it's, the description was it was beyond a cost, the cost for the new item, similar to what we are throwing away, is less than the cost it would be to fix it. So I don't know if we are replacing them or not. But you don't have to answer that, you could.
Yeah, I'll follow up with you.
All right, so just to check back with the clerk, we did take the vote on that already?
Yes.
Okay. And that brings us up to, hold on, your computer, hang on. Okay. That brings us up to public commentary for non-agenda items. No cards? No cards. Okay, closing remarks by board members. Does anybody have any closing remarks for tonight?
Yeah, we
We
can-
did, he asked a question after the vote.
Okay, I
Yeah,
thought
question came out.
it interrupted the vote. Okay.
What was that?
I thought it interrupted the vote.
We had taken the vote already. Any closing remarks by any trustees? All right. That concludes our business agenda for tonight. It is now 10:03. Is there a motion to adjourn? Motion by trustee Trent, seconded by anybody? Trustee Flippin. All those in favor? Seeing all hands raised, the motion passes unanimously. We stand adjourned. Thank you very much.